Why are you here? You're here to outwork. You're here to outtrain. You're here to win.
Here with Dr. Stuart McGill, one of the best doc backs in the business. Back docs, my mistake again. But I've been following your work since Doctor of Osteopathy Jason Hartman turned me on to you a few years ago. He's a sports doc in Philadelphia, and I've been trying to incorporate a lot of the things that you have been teaching through your clinic and in your writings with a lot of success. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. It's my pleasure. I always love talking to the people who are inspiring our young athletes. So thank you for all you do.
I'd like to start off. I coached, been coaching wrestling, some MMA, and a few other sports for the last 30 years. And our culture today, with a subset of parents, is sport obsession with their kids. And I really wanted to talk to you to try and help guide these people, these parents, to help take the best care of their children possible. We don't want children to be incapacitated after their athletic career. And I wonder if you've experienced this phenomena and if you could say a few words about this type of parent-child health in sports relationship.
Yes. Three things come to mind when I hear that question. And the first thing that I would like to establish is sport is a fabulous vehicle for developing the young mind and body, the sense of gamesmanship, development of strategy, developing a heart of a lion, all of the good things that we associate with building successful adults. But I know exactly where you're coming from with that question. So when I get a young patient, and I'm a back pain specialist, so people only come to see me with back injury. When I get a young wrestler or a young athlete, and then I say to them, well, tell me about your training so I understand the exposure to their body. And they'll tell me, well, they do this and that. And I say, really? Well, that sounds like a good schedule. Tell me the times and what you're doing. And they say, well, I get up and I go for my run before school. And then after school, I do my wrestling or MMA technique. Then I go to jiu-jitsu. And then the next day, I only go to jiu-jitsu, but then I meet with a sports psychologist. And then the day after, I go with the mobility yoga person, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I compare them to some of the top athletes I work with who are very successful adults. And I listened to the regimen, and somewhere along the line, there was no master coach in all of this. And the parents had absolutely missed it, because I say to the young athlete, can you tell me when your last day off was? And the room goes silent. And now there is a reason why we have a broken down young athlete, broken down physically, and quite often what goes along with that is mentally. So that's my first little story to give some perspective on that. The second one is, it's so interesting when I'm gauging the parent-athlete relationship. So there'll be a dad who brings a athlete to me, and it's been a big deal. They've flown 2,000 miles to come. I'm up in northern Ontario here, and I've got some father from Iowa or something with a young wrestler, and I'll say something, and then the dad answers, well, we do this for the nutrition, and then we do that to get ready. And I look at him and I say, sir, it's not we. This is about your son. It's about him. I want to hear the word, this is what I do. And then again, I quite often have a very serious talk with the parent. Some of them are very humbled because we're able to probe the athlete, replicate their pain, and show them that the pain is not random, it's deterministic. There is a mechanism of their pain associated either with inappropriate rehab they've had or more likely inappropriate excessive training. And they've broken down the tissues. Everything in biology has a tipping point. Think of a vitamin. If you're, let's take a fat-soluble vitamin like vitamin D. If you're deficient, you're ill. And then you take a supplement, you gain your health, but only to the tipping point. If you take excessive vitamin D, it's a poison and you get sick. And this is the way it is with every phenomenon in biology. And I have to explain to them that the training that they're doing is so far beyond the tipping point. I mean, training is to extend the tipping point to build training capacity. You're not allowed to cross it. If you want health and high-level performance. But it's some very interesting discussions, but they can't argue with the science, and many of them are humbled and apologetic, and I think they get it.
In your experience, is there a difference in the age of athletes and their need for recovery? I mean, it seems like the youth athlete needs more recovery time, maybe through puberty and college a little less, and then the adult athlete seems more in need of recovery. Thoughts?
The first is I'm not an expert on growth and development, and there's someone like Dr. Avery Feigenbaum might be the best person to ask that question of. But I would look at that more at the individual. There are always those individuals who have a higher capacity to train, and there are those who naturally just take a bit longer to recover. But that's from a physiological perspective. When we get into back injury, for example, different tissues heal at very different rates. So if we have a young athlete who damages the growth plate of their spine, that's a little bit of a bigger deal than if they were to damage it when they were 18 years, and even if they were 35 years. And the contrast on that would be that growth plate and end plate, which really determines the ability of the spine to bear compressive load. When we look at the grand old men and women of powerlifting, they have sclerotic end plates. And what that means is they've had little microfractures from progressive overload on that for years and years, building this very calloused bone that allows them to bear weight. And then I see a young wrestler or MMA athlete, and the coach has them deadlifting their body weight, and not realizing that they too are creating the same microfractures as the big boys. However, that microfracture, they're training like bodybuilders. They train, they think they're breaking down muscle, they take a day off to allow the muscle adaptation, and then the next day they're back training again. But deadlifting is very different for a young spine.
Right.
It takes about 5 days for those, and I'm talking at the molecular bone level now, for those microfractures on the end plates to scaffold in new molecules of calcium and magnesium to really develop strength of bone and support in that young spine. So there's just an example of the differential. Children and adolescents are not mini adults from a biological perspective. The game is different.
Yeah. So sticking with that, the recovery time, and wrestling is really a combination of strength and flexibility and dynamic motion. Is there a formula for you that combines the stability of the spine and the spine health with those two elements of flexibility and the strength that we want to build in a wrestler?
What a fabulous question. So athletics pull different demands from the body, and wrestling is unique in that. I'll just contrast that with, let's say, an American footballer, where we have an articulated linkage system that forms our skeleton and our body. I'm just going to give you an example now. If I want to wiggle my finger very quickly like this, I had to stiffen my wrist. So proximal stiffness allows distal athleticism, and I can work through the linkage the same way. So if I'm boxing on the offensive line and I want to create a tremendous push, I had to stiffen my core. Otherwise, I just push my own core away rather than creating stiffness and resistance behind the push to push the opponent. So the law of creating proximal stiffness in a linkage, it's non-negotiable for a football player. But when you're on the ground, on the mat, the game changes. You become reptilian, and we have to create reptilian spine motion. So now the spine it can't be stiffened rigid to unleash the power of the hip. You do that in a deadlift, of course, if you were doing it in a suplex throw or something in a standing expression of that athleticism on the wrestling mat. But when they're on the ground, the game changes. So now sometimes they will create distal stability. They'll put a hand out, create a foot plant, and then do a spinal rotation to get the pin or shrimp out if we're talking jiu-jitsu or whatever it happens to be. So now the game changes and the preparations are slightly different. So you're right. It is a very unique blend of stability and mobility, and the wrestler more than anyone, well, wrestlers, MMA, even swimmers to some extent, change the game in terms of this stability-mobility interplay. Well, now we have some other biological rules that we have to follow. Power is force times velocity. So when I create speed across my elbow with lots of power, say I'm doing some kind of a rip or an underhook to gain say in a Greco-Roman hold, a body lock or something like that, then I have to be quick and explosive. But if you use a lot of strength when you're moving very quickly, that is power, force times velocity. Now let's look at the spine. The spine is a system of blocks of bone. In other words, it's a flexible rod. So it allows us to do all these reptilian things on the mat. But if you move your spine at the same time as you're creating very high force, high power is what can create back injury. So when you look at, remember old Karelin from Russia, what he would do, and you would watch it, he would flex his spine and get in a tremendous deviated position, but he would then lock his spine in that position and throw with the hips. So the great ones always explode power out of the hips. The ones who get hurt are the ones who explode power out of their spine. So it's okay to move your back for wrestlers. In fact, you must. But the technique is when you're quickly moving your back, take the load out of it. But when it comes time to set up that throw, as you know, it's hip driving a stiffened, flexible rod that doesn't move now. It's a lump of iron. Now you've you've followed the laws of creating a resilient spine and linkage. So there's just a little bit of a thought to conclude that whole mobility stability continuum.
It's interesting. I also coach football, and the NFL, USA Football is now saying the exact same thing. They've had so many back injuries that you stiffen the back and then you get the explosion through the hips, which they usually
go look at who their keynote speaker was last year at the Combine.
Was this you?
It was me. And then if you look at this year, if you look at the professional coaches, which is the NFL strength and conditioning coaches, they brought in 3 speakers for the Injury Resiliency Summit.
That's no coincidence. I just watched all my stuff for my recertification as a coach, and I'm like, this is completely changed, and it looks like wrestling, where you bring the hips in, and good work.
Yeah, no, we're quite well known among the NFL coaches. You can ask them.
That's fantastic. Talking a little bit about getting athletes into the sport at the youth level, probably pre-puberty, trying to create prevention of injuries. do you recommend everybody just starting with the big three that you've come up with, which is the bird dog, the curl up, and the side plank?
I heard two questions there.
Okay.
And the first one, when you're starting young ones off, can I address that first before we get into the specific tool? So now we have a little bit of an intellectual discussion, and it's one of preparation. So, some people say, oh, this is dangerous. You get the moms who are driving their little kiddies to school every day thinking there's a man that's going to violate their kid if they allow them to walk and whatnot. But what they're doing is they're robbing them of the resiliency that they need for life, both from a psychological point of view and a physicality point of view as well. And I would take combat sports in exactly the same way. It is so empowering for our young kids to know how to handle their bodies as long as they have the psychological discipline on top of all of that. So I'm 100% in favor of exposure to these arts, and we can call them the combative arts in a positive way. But then we get into the point, which I think where you've headed, where's that tipping point, and how much do we formalize it? How much do we tell them about injury? And okay, well, let's go and wrestle and throw a few strikes and this kind of stuff. But watch you don't hurt yourself. So this is a delicate balance. Usually, I don't know how you grew up, but every night I had a play fight with my dad on the living room floor. And that's when we learned leverage and, when do you tap? And of course, they let you win and you learn. And these are all things that are so valuable. I remember him telling me the stories of, going back to, Henry Cooper and Marciano and, the Heart of the Lion. And I remember this is long before the Rocky movies.
Sure.
It's developed the Heart of the Lion. You don't give up, you keep going. And if that doesn't work, you turn around and you try this and you keep pushing, So just to create strength and leverage and resiliency in the body, I think it's fabulous. But how much at that young age?
I'm sorry. Can I just ask a follow-up to that? So wrestling around with the dad, roughhousing, I think it's not only is it awesome physiologically, but emotionally for the family, all these things. There's certain dads who want to then start teaching, let's say, wrestling or jiu-jitsu. I'm always saying, stick with the roughhousing, the kid play, whether it's a pillow fight or balance, whatever it is, and it's a progression. Have you experienced at a high level, to me, most people who gravitate towards contact sports had this as a background with their father or a father figure. Have you ever noticed that as a background for these people who excel?
No, I haven't made that specific observation.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
I know there were some kids. I mean, I look at some of some of the fabulous MMA fighters that I've worked with, and it's interesting. And I don't know if you ever wanted to go to this place in this particular podcast, but I feel most of them are in the cage fighting their father.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that person who they might have bullied them, they may have psychologically bullied them, but they are fighting their father in there, and they may have been bullied at school, but there's usually a darkness that they are able to pull out, and in real life, they're marvelous people, because if they allowed the darkness to come out on the street, they'd be in jail. They wouldn't be in the UFC. So they control it very calmly. But man, when that light bulb switches, look out, and that darkness comes through. But we see that killer instinct in all walks of life, and whether it came from roughhousing or just some experience. But I do believe in exposure to some of that. As you know, I've retired. I was a professor for 32 years. And over those 30 years, I watched the product that came in first year from our high schools. 30 years ago, say there was some, usually a bigger male student in the back trying to impress a girl, and they wouldn't shut up, and I would get annoyed at them. And they might be an athlete, a wrestler, or a footballer or whatnot, and I'd invite them down to the front of the room for an arm wrestle. And it gave me the forum to teach. I'm teaching an introductory course in movement. All right, look at all the dirty tricks I'm going to use now, because I didn't lose very often.
Right.
And then as I got white hair and became older, man, if I did that to one of the students now, they're so soft, I would break their arm or worse. And not only that, their parents would be calling the university for
therapy.
Yeah, I couldn't teach how to express athleticism out of the body with the softness and the pervasiveness of it. Yeah. So I don't know if you wanted to go there or not. But anyway, no, I don't know if it's always from the father. You see wonderfully supportive fathers who create fabulous athletes as well. So it's the full spectrum.
So I didn't mean to interrupt the progression though for the youth athlete and the introduction to trying to make sports safer for them.
Right. Well, training physicality, of course. If you don't do it, you have high risk. And if you do too much of it, you have high risk. So we can get into specific exercises like what we call the big three, if you wish. But if I could back up just a little bit and establish a scientific principle, so we're arguing from principle or creating a recommendation from science. Exercises are simply tools to reach a goal. That's all they are. So let's write down on a piece of paper what the goals are, and then go into our toolbox and pull out the best exercises to achieve those goals. So if we get into core and the scientific principle of you must have proximal stiffness if you're going to run fast and change direction and throw a ball or whatever the task is. The work that we've done over the years, the very best three exercises that keep bubbling up to the top for beginning the core are the big three, which is the bird dog, the side plank, and the curl up. And some people will dismiss the simplicity of them, and yet they might be surprised to know that the powerlifter who owns the highest Wilks score of all time, that's the strongest fella who's ever, the highest bench press, squat, and deadlift, starts his warm-ups and his daily routine every day with the big three for a reason. There are many players in the NFL. There are many coaches in the NFL who start every training session with the big three. Why? A stiffer core enables more power development in the hip to be expressed in propelling the leg rather than bending the spine. Because the big three, when you hold them for 10 seconds and release them and hold them for another 10 seconds, build a residual stiffness. And that tight core stays in some people for 20 minutes and others it stays for 2 hours when we measure it. So they run and cut a little bit faster. They can express more hip power, etc. So there's and by the way, they're spine sparing. They don't use up training capacity. So you can, again, every player only has so much training capacity. Yeah. So if you choose an exercise that doesn't chew up much capacity, now you've got a whole lot more to train other good things as well. But if you do inappropriate exercise, it chews up all their capacity, and then more exercise only crosses the tipping point.
Right. I've had the same experience where I've coached a kid who was an NCAA AllAmerican and was laughing at a warm-up that I gave him, and he couldn't do the curl-up. This guy is an animal. And it took him probably a week before he could coordinate his body and activate his muscles. And it changed his mind about how they look simple, but there's we're making sure things work.
If they only knew of the pro athletes who will come up and they got hurt because they couldn't breathe while doing a curl up. And I'll give you many examples of that. I'll get an NBA basketball player who's been assigned to box out Shaq O'Neal. Now, you think you're going to do that without some physicality, you're dreaming. But if you get a soft core by breathing at the wrong time or getting a soft core and not allowing the diaphragm to create the lung ventilation, and they relax their core, he will get you not only out of position and get the rebound, he will make your back pay. I can think of one of the greatest MMA athletes of all time, and it's on YouTube. You may guess who it is. But I said to him one time, "Would you show me how you lock in an armbar on me?" And I know a little bit. I have very rudimentary skills, but I thought there's no way he's going to get an armbar on me and submit me. He had me done in 3 seconds, and I said, "How did you do that?" Because, I was defending and whatnot. And he said, your arm was there. I needed it over here, so I dug your liver reflex. Bang, you just gave me your arm. That's textbook medical neurology. And then he said, I waited for you to exhale, to breathe out. And then he locked it in because I got a little bit soft. So, these people who think it's not important, I don't think have been at the elite level. Do the curl up. Hold it for 10 seconds and breathe deeply. It's a very good translatory exercise to the wrestling mat.
I know the follow-up question to this is, I'm sure there's a ton of difference in everybody individually. Have you noticed in your work a difference of doing that in injury prevention versus recovery from a back injury?
Well, not only have I noticed it, I've measured it.
Okay.
Oh, it's all very well documented. We follow up with every patient that we've ever seen, which is rather rare. I don't know of another clinician who does that. So we know exactly how the athlete presented. We know what we gave them to do. We know if they complied or not, and we know how they were a year later. So we know what's successful.
Moving on, the next one I've read is the stir the pot, or the the walking out bridge.
Right.
And I know that starts leveraging a ton of more force on the core, but really teaches kids to get into that battle position, whether it's wrestling, MMA. Sometimes I have athletes who are high school level who have a hard time making that transition from the curl up to walking their arms out and really holding it. I think it's probably close to 100%, I guess, effort when you're holding your arms out straight on the front.
So what we're talking about is you take a push-up position and you walk your hands forward and you hold it. That is 100% stimulus and neural drive to the abdominal wall, 100%. So you'll never get that in a sit-up. A sit-up, believe it or not, is actually quite a low challenge for the muscles. And when you do it repeatedly, say, if you're doing 20 sit-ups, you're only stimulating the muscles to a very low level of neural drive. But if you want a Herculean core and a core of iron, that walkout exercise will get it. I've measured many different top-level athletes from many Olympic sports, the NFL, world strongman competitors, MMA fighters, and whatnot. The strongest core I've ever measured, and I'll tell you who it is. I don't really like measuring. I don't like mentioning names, but it's well known. We're on YouTube together. It's Pavel Tsatsouline, the Russian Superman. He's got the strongest core. Now, he trains to stop motion with his core. Now, if you get him to kick a bag, it is ungodly. Mike, you'd rather be hit by a Honda.
So I've seen his videos. Strong First. I'm a big fan.
Oh, he is a Superman, and I'm the only guy in the world who's ever measured his neurology. He's incredibly fast, got a core of iron, knows how to unleash his hips. but it's training to stop motion. So, when you watch him train doing the landmine exercise, he's not twisting his spine, although he can and kick like a horse.
Yeah.
But that's not the way he trains. He trains to stop motion, pivoting around the balls, allowing the power to come from his hips and shoulders. So, I see it time and time again. He honors the biological tipping point, and he works in a way to extend it, but never to pass it. And this is the key to injury resilience and developing Herculean performance.
So the other thing that always stands out to me if I watch a Pavel video, a friend of mine that has trained with him, is, all right, so he's got this incredible core, but he has got some of the quickest hips I've ever seen. So you've measured his core strength. What does that look like? And is there a measure for hip speed? And can you build hip speed underneath that strong back?
Well, you can. First of all, to have hip speed, it's non-negotiable. You have to have core stability. Otherwise, when your hip muscles explode, your spine just bends.
Right.
But what you really need is to get the thighs to propel even faster. Or I'll give you an example. I'd just done teaching a course. It was down in the States, and I was at the airport waiting for my flight, and I thought, well, I've just taught for 8 hours, I'll have a beer. And Venus Williams was on the tennis, on the TV in the bar. And the announcer said, oh, Venus is intimidating the opposition today with the big grunt. And I thought, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Why she grunts is you do this, and it stiffens the core even more. We call it active expiration. So you even super drive the abdominal wall even tighter. And now it tightens the core, so the muscles crossing the shoulder joint, they don't move the core. 100% of their action moves the arm, and she gets a few more miles an hour on the tennis ball. And it's exactly the same thing when you're running in the NFL. You don't want your hip muscles to bend your pelvis and your spine. You want your hip muscles to bend your thighs so you can be explosive on cuts and directional change and all that kind of thing. So anyway, that core, it's non-negotiable. And now, Mike, I forgot what question I was answering.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So in certain sports, it's not acceptable. Let's say screaming out to tighten your core in wrestling, MMA generally doesn't happen. But I've tried to teach it through Pavel's breathing right out, squeezing. Are there any other techniques that you recommend for that?
Absolutely. I've measured this in the top strikers in the UFC. I measured 6 top UFC athletes. 3 of them at one time in their life were in the the UFC weight division championship. So these are the best. What I measured in them from their core perspective was what we call the double pulse. So they are maybe in some defense, they set up a punch, but the one where we're measuring, they pulse and then they relax to let the arm, because muscles when they contract do 2 things. Yes, they create force, but they also create stiffness. And if you try and hit someone with your muscle, you push the punch. And it's a very soft punch. The guys with the big muscles, they're not the one. But you measure guys like I have. They don't always look that impressive, but they can unleash and relax. And then when they hit you, they have the second pulse. Boom! They turn their body to stone. At that time, they're not hitting you with the weight of their fist and arm. They're hitting you, if they're a welterweight, with 175 pounds of stone. Again, you'd rather be hit by a car, but it came from speed. So, people like Bruce Lee used to write about this. I relax until the instant my fist hits the target, and then I focus all my energy on it. So that's a description of the pulsing neurology that they create. If I was to use a football example, do you remember the Oakland Raider defensive half? His name is escaping me for just a moment now.
Jack Tatum?
Jack Tatum.
Tatum.
It's Jack Tatum. And, in my role now, as you know, I pretty much specialize in athletes with back pain. when I get some of the old NFL players and we get talking, I say, who did you really hate to play against? Not because they were necessarily a dirty player, but they hurt you.
Yeah.
And I'll do it with the old NHL hockey players. Who really didn't you want to play against? And it's the same names that keep coming up. And it's those guys who could turn their body to stone when they hit you. And it wasn't dirt. It was just like running into an immovable bus.
Yeah.
And in football, it was Jack Tatum. He was loose as a goose, but when he hit you, he turned his body to stone and he went through you. Yeah. And in hockey, it's the same guys all the time. Mark Messier and Scott Stevens of Washington. They hit. It was like hitting stone. And that's exactly the tricks that they use. Pavel has it. The great tennis players have it just to hit a ball. The great wrestlers have it when they are using an explosive move. That you can't push rope, as you know.
Right.
You have to have something solid to push. Even a sprinter coming out of the block has a rock-solid core, so when the hip explodes, it's a hammer, and the hammer hits the core of stone to propel it. If it hits the core that's soft, all the spine bends. You're pushing rope. You've lost all the athleticism. So wrestling and the combative arts is this wonderful dance between stiffness, pushing stone, explosive, and then becoming a reptile to get around it, to crush an opponent in a submission or whatever it happens to be. And this is the neurology of the athleticism. So the exercises that we use to develop that, yes, we develop core stiffness beginning with the big three, but of course we progress the core work, we progress the neurological. Remember, those exercises are simply tools, and we know those are the objectives that we need to reach with our tools, so we're going to be choosing them to create those.
A lot of kids get to a level, boys that I've worked with, they're in high school, they're in college. I'm a big proponent of the kettlebells, probably because I'm a fan of Pavel and I've seen it work for very strong athletes, and they get to the point where I don't have enough weight on a kettlebell to get strong. Any thoughts on free weights, kettlebells, and what your favorite is, and any of the exercises? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with goat bellies, or the weight swing. I mean, the weight swing with the kettlebell is my favorite combat sport exercise, just because it's like being in a fight for as long as you're going to do it.
I don't know what the weight swing is. What is that?
That's the kettlebell between the legs and then coming up to your chest.
Oh, okay. So it's just two-handed kettlebell swing. I'm
yeah.
well aware of that. Yeah,
okay.
If you look in the literature, I think I'm the only guy who's measured the mechanics of those. So I can tell you, like a discussion of any exercise tool or any exercise, my answer is always, it depends. Let's go through both sides of the argument. The kettlebell swing is an absolutely fabulous exercise for the neurology that we were just discussing. So it creates a stiffness, and then you have to learn to unleash your hips to swing the bell. And it's a little bit of a pulsing neurology. It's fabulous. However, let me contrast that now to a deadlift or a pull of a bar from the floor. When you bend over and pull a bar, this is the compression load down your spine, and this is the shear load. Your spine is built for a certain ratio of compression to shear. When you bend down, the facet joints in the spine support the shear load as you pull the weight through. A kettlebell begins with that normal ratio of compression to shear. You're down in basically a flex lifting position. And then as the bar comes through, centrifugal forces start to take over now, and it's a pulling force when you get to the top of the arc. And it now creates a shear force on your back. Well, Pavel, as you know, brilliant athlete, has stiffening strategies that he will use to control that shear load at the top of the swing. People who don't know what they're doing and don't know how to coach it properly won't look after the shear load. And after a few weeks, the athlete might say, this is my back's getting a little bit tweaky. Well, then they might get sent to me. And the first thing I will do with them is what we call a prone shear instability test. So I will put their upper body on the exam table and get them to completely relax, and with my thumb, I shear just about a kilo or two, or 2.5 pounds for you Americans. I just push on the spinous processes, and the athlete will tell me, there's a painful one. Well, I've just probed pain with only 2 kilos or a kilo of shear. Well, the kettlebell swing causes a lot more shear than that. And I'll say, you know what? Kettlebell swings aren't for you at this point in time. Let's choose a more shear conserving category of exercise. Let's lean back and do some TRX pulls. 0 shear, it's a 3-point bend. So there might be an example of that. And when I wrote our scientific report and published it in the Strength and Conditioning Journal on the kettlebell swing, I quoted 2 very famous athletes in the first paragraph. So since I quoted them all, I'm at liberty to mention them here. One was Brad Gillingham, who at the time held the world raw deadlift. And he said, after my disc herniation, it was kettlebell swings that reconditioned my back to come back and be the champion once again. The next athlete I quoted, and I didn't use his name for this reason, very, very strong, accomplished man, but he said, I can lift incredible weight off the ground, do this and that, but kettlebell swings is the one thing that tweaks my back. And the reason is his particular trigger of pain happened to be shear load. So back pain, it's not random. There's always a cause. And my job is to determine the cause through a thorough assessment and then design a program, A, that doesn't replicate their particular pain trigger, and then B, builds their body to become resilient to that eventually. But just to finish off the whole discussion about kettlebell swings, Pavel tells a lovely story. I never met Bruce Lee. I wish I did. But if you go back to that movie, Enter the Dragon, which I know is a bit of a Hollywood movie, but his opponent in that Enter the Dragon movie was the Hollywood karate master of the day, a fellow named John Saxon. And John's still around today, still training with kettlebells. And he tells the story the very first time he trained with Bruce Lee, Bruce was swinging a homemade kettlebell. And Pavel tells this beautifully. But what Bruce Lee was doing, he would swing the kettlebell very relaxed. But then when the kettlebell came up to horizontal, Bruce would put a pulse in it, like this, and then relax. Come on up, pulse. What he was doing was creating the athletic foundation of what later became known as the 1-inch punch. Which is an incredibly powerful athletic maneuver. It's fabulous for combative athletes. It's the thing that I was describing Jack Tatum had, that ability to be loose, but at the moment of contact to create that, pull that pulse out of the body for the athletic effect. And yet kettlebells were used to that. Used for that. Something just came to mind as I was talking there as well. We try and create athleticism and athletic resiliency by training different patterns of movements, not isolationist muscles and bodybuilding moves, but to create that farm boy strength. And combative athletes cannot avoid carrying. You have to carry stuff in your training. And eventually, they might start off with a suitcase carry, which would be carrying a load in one hand, and maybe a bilateral carry, which would be a farmer's walk. But what Pavel introduced to all of us was the bottoms-up kettlebell carry, carrying the kettlebell bottoms up. It forces a stiff core. If you don't, grip strength doesn't matter anymore. The kettlebell will still fall out of position. But think of overhead pressing now. If you take a kettlebell, grab the horn in your hand, and take the kettlebell and carry it on the back of your wrist, and now do an overhead press. So here's a wrestler who they've had arm cranks, and, we have to look after their shoulders a little bit. But let's build some overhead pressing power, not with a dumbbell, with which by definition you have to pull the elbow around underneath the hand to press the dumbbell. Well, I just put my shoulder into impingement. But if I do a kettlebell, different tool, but the same exercise. The kettlebell rests on the back of my forearm. Now the elbow comes back, takes that precious shoulder out of impingement, and now I can train an overhead press. So there's just another example of the uniqueness and advantage, I suppose, of building that tipping point and avoiding the injury mechanism.
While we're here, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on a lot of guys who are doing traditional strength training with their high school or college end up having an upper back issue that seems to be related to where their shoulder blades fall. Is there anything, I'm not sure if this fits here, but I've just experienced, even with Division I athletes, shoulder blades displaying in a winged fashion, and then the kids feel like they have a knot in the upper part of their back. Is there anything that the big three helps with shoulder blade position within the back and the spine?
Well, it certainly can, and it's all a matter of how it's coached. For example, if you're setting up a bird dog and the young athlete is showing you a winged scapula, I just place my hand on their back and I say, push the earth away, and they push their back up into my hand, gliding the scapulae with serratus anterior support into that strong centrated position. So if they have upper back pain or discomfort and that takes it away, there's your secret sauce. So you're right on. There will be some athletes, though, where that will cause pain depending on what their particular trigger is. So for those athletes, I need to see more complexity to the movement. And I might start them off very simply, sit down in a chair. And now I want you to slouch. Now I ask them to pull up out of the slouch. Some of them simply rotate their thoracic spine about the exact area that you're saying is grumpy. So their problem is in their brain. It's a software problem. Their strategy for aligning their spine was through the painful spine itself. We call it a spine hinge. Conversely, if they simply flexed through their hips, their pelvis would rotate forward and the spine would align above it for free, avoiding the pain trigger. So I have a series of tests, to determine whether it is a motion or a posture or an anatomic issue like the winging scapula. I might have them stand up and I'll say, carry a 45-pound or a 20-kilo Olympic bar in a back squat position on your back. Now simply roll your pelvis forward and backwards like this, doing a pelvic tilt back and forth. And then I'll see if that replicates their pain. And then I'm watching the strategy that their brain is creating to move their back. And then it might be simply a pattern of or an exercise to change the pattern away from the motion-triggered back pain, for example. So, the answer is it always depends. The assessment will reveal what triggers the pain. Now you know what exercise tool what exercise tool you're going to use, and it may simply be mental training. Change the software program that they're running. In other words, their muscle memory is corrupted. It's inappropriate.
So to change that software, you need a good trainer who's going to help you go through it and to make that adjustment so the hardware changes and then the software changes?
Absolutely. How do you create a new athletic skill? It is repetition of perfection. And you create that, what the lay coach calls muscle memory, the neuroscientist calls an engram. So pain corrupts engrams. Injury can corrupt engrams. I'll give you a prime example. Take a police officer and they come in with back pain, but they're off duty. They're not wearing their duty belt and their gun and ammo and all that stuff. And then you watch them walk, and they walk as if they still have their duty belt on. Their arms are swinging out to the side that goes around their gun, etc. So there is a learned corruption to the engram pattern. There are young athletes who never developed engrams in the first place because they were starved of athletic exposure. So, the real criminal cases of, you see these kids who were in cribs until they were 3 years old and whatnot, and they
Right.
don't know how to crawl, roll, move. They don't know how to break a fall. Or you get I had a kid who was brought to me, and I'll be a little bit careful about what I'm saying here, but they were on the pro tennis tour for a very short period of time. Their father put a tennis racket in their hand when they were 4 years old. They didn't have the resilience in their body. And anyway, their body broke down. Wasn't there? Yeah, anyway, you know what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
I got a bit off topic on your question. I'm
A
sorry.
couple follow-ups there. One of those, to avoid an engram of your sport, I think is one of the values of having multi-sport athletes as kids. You never want to look like you're an athlete. You don't want to look like a wrestler. When you're walking, you don't want to look like a policeman. Any thoughts on being a multi-sport athlete? And
I'm very, very strong in that opinion. Let them play.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I remember I'll use some of my own kids as examples, I guess, which I really ought not to. But, I would watch how kids develop in basketball. Well, I've been around the NBA long enough to know that almost all of them are late athletic developers. You cannot have a 6'9" kid who's a good athlete in grade 10. It's not possible.
Right.
They're the geeks. They're gangly. They haven't grown into their bodies, so they don't even make their high school basketball teams. Some of them. And when I watch the development of an NFL player versus an NBA basketball player, the timeline is different. Yeah, I know there's LeBron James and the people who've absolutely been touched by the hand of God. I understand those. But the normal case is the guys come into the NBA and they serve their apprenticeship on the bench for a couple of years. That's the norm. It takes a while for them to grow into their body. So the bigger the athlete, the longer the development. But what do they do in high school? They pick the very best athlete to be on the basketball team at 5'10". They're fabulous when they're 5'10", when everyone else is maybe 6 foot or 6'2", but they'll never make the NBA.
Right.
So we have this crazy development program of, you were a good athlete, and then they become this great athlete, but they were the best point in their life was when they were in high school. What a shame. What a shame. And we lose those athletes who do have the athletic potential, but it just takes longer to develop. So again, I get back to this idea, forget about all the heavy competitive sport when they're young, because those kids are not going to be the world champions. Let them play. And then as they grow into their bodies, the athleticisms will start to come out. But, really at the end of the day, who cares? Your job is you're building people.
Right.
You're not building the next Olympian. You're building great citizens.
Going to change the subject a little bit, and I agree completely with you.
By the way, I hope you are, and I know you are.
I totally am.
I didn't get any reaction there, so
no, I'm totally into it. I agree. On my website, I talk about that all the time. I don't have the studies in front of me, but the youth champions are never the post-adolescent champions, or they are at such a low rate. The state champion as a 8th grader most likely isn't playing that same sport once they've gone through puberty. The stats are insane. And it's terrible to lose those people because they were good athletes. Let them have fun and then get serious on their own. So yeah. I'm completely with you. I'm going to change the subject just a little bit because we're getting really long here. But I've heard you talk about spine flexion potentially causing problems with especially people with larger spines. And in wrestling, we do a lot of tumbling, forward rolls, backward rolls. Is this something that a coach or a trainer should be aware of and limit? as they're trying? Are there other ways to, if it is a problem, are there other ways to create that kind of tumbling athleticism?
Well, that's a fabulous question because let's establish some scientific principles here. I will have to talk about spine size because that matters, but I have to go back to that concept of power. So if you bend a spine and there's no load down it, I think you're okay. In fact, it's not I think, I know. Yeah, the cumulative trauma, you're probably building the tissues more than you're breaking them down, so you're honoring the tipping point. However, say you were under 100 kilos or 200 pounds, and then you started to bend your spine, that's a problem. Okay. So tumbling is very low load, and as you know, the whole technique, a good tumbler really has minimal impact when you roll. You know, you drop the shoulder, you roll, you curve your spine, and around you go and pop back up. So that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about flawed technique under heavy load. That's the thing that damages back. So people don't hear that part of the equation and they say, oh, well, McGill's against all spine flexion, which is just silliness because they don't know the athletes that we have to create. But now let's talk about spine size. If I took a long tube and I bent it, well, let me use a nature example. Let's take a thin willow branch. If I took that thin willow branch, I could bend it back and forth, no stress, all day long. It wouldn't damage. But if I took a thicker stick and bent it to the same amount of bend, it would shatter. So the stress in a long tube is a function of its radial diameter. So this is what we measure in athletes. If you take the archetypical PGA golfer, they have a slender spine. They're not built for Olympic lifting and vice versa. To survive at middle linebacker in the NFL, you can't have a slender golfer spine. You need a pretty thick, robust spine. So now those two architectures are different athleticisms, and you have to train them a different way. And the stress points are totally different. So if you gave 100 sit-ups to a middle linebacker, chances are you're really stressing those bigger, rounder discs. But if you gave it to a smaller, a gymnast frame or a lighter, finer boned athlete, there's much less stress. By the same token, I know the golfer won't survive in the NFL, but if it was universal athleticism, that would mean the great athletic middle linebacker could hit a long golf ball, and you'll notice they don't exist. So the stresses of twisting those big, thick spines to hit a long golf ball, it's not possible. So, you know, you can't train a St. Bernard to win at the Greyhound track. Right. You've got to consider that and choose the tools to pull out those athleticisms and treat each. Well, as a scientist, we would call it an anatomical phenotype, but for a coach, it's just, you know, is that a long-legged, short-bodied athlete, or do they have, you know, where are you getting your leverage points from? What's the technique? What are the exercise tools? That's your job, to tune all that to those players and pull out the fun of movement with minimal stress.
Going back to some flexion, I'm not sure if you've ever measured it. Wrestlers do bridges quite often. Front bridge doesn't really bend the spine very much. The back bridge does create quite a U in the spine because the hip can't really hinge that way. Any thoughts on that as this go back to body size?
Absolutely. Now, I'm not the cervical spine or the neck spine world's expert. If anything on the low back, I'm all game for. But having said that, some of the same principles apply. What I then ask is, does the person have a history of injury, damage, pain? Because if they do, now we have a special consideration. So what I do is assess them. And is the pain or pathology triggered by compressing the neck, shearing the neck, bending the neck? We figure that out. And if it's let's say it's a shear injury. So, you know, you've seen the neck exercises where you push and hold this way and you push and hold that way and that way. Every one of those is a shearing of the cervical spine. And if you just test shearing and that causes their pain, obviously you can't do it. But let's create some other tools. One might be I would get the athlete to sit nice and tall. This will probably make you laugh, but touch the teeth together and now push the tongue hard to the roof of the mouth and feel all these deep flexors now come up. Just try that. Push your tongue hard. Take your finger and feel the flexors underneath. Relax your neck.
Yeah.
Now push the tongue. Now we bring all that. Now start to grimace a little bit. There you go. That's what I want. Now that's what's behind. In front, put two fists under your chin. Now you start, no, your chin is too high now. Just keep your head, no, look, Mike, you're funny. You placed your chin on your fist. I didn't want that. Lock it in neutral. Now bring your fist up to it. Now, there you go. Now, push the tongue, grimace, consider your neck. Now start to push upwards, and your job is to pull down with the chin. So now I'm building a very resilient neck, and I've avoided all the compression, the bend, and the shear that was causing the pain to that athlete in the first place. So there's a little bit of an example of how we'll choose an exercise tool based on their past pain generators to rebuild their neck, avoiding the pain trigger, desensitizing the pain, and building their athleticism back.
Gotcha. Okay.
But you can't beat some of the other things, if I may, because this is so important. Again, I see deadlifting has become such the rage with the Facebook kids and this kind of thing. And I see horrible form, people pulling the bar, and then as they come to top dead center, they collapse their neck into flexion, and they do it again. They pull this tremendous weight off the ground and collapse their neck at the end, which I get it. You're changing the length tension curve of erector spina. You're also the number of deadlifters and powerlifters I get with neck pathology from that one single move. So, there's another piece of the puzzle. Don't do stupid things with your neck by poor technique in other exercises. So things like shoulder shrugs and whatnot, these are all fabulous neck exercises. But good form creates resilience and training capacity. Bad form robs it.
This is off topic or off script. You don't have to answer this. I've coached maybe 100 kids to go on and do sports in college, and contact sports, usually wrestling, football. One kid was a rower. So I've been around a lot of different high-level sports programs, and I think it's getting better, but it seems like the sports trainers at high-level schools don't know what good technique is in many cases. Kids can't perform their sport because their low back hurts after they are done at their weight training day. I'm not sure if you've noticed this, if you think there's a cause. I used to think it was because the wages were so low that anybody who was a good trainer was in private practice, not working for a university. Any thoughts on this?
More than half of the patients that I see have been caused by those trainers.
Okay.
How's that for an indictment? Yeah. What is now going out there? It is incredible. Not only do they not understand what good form is to pull out athleticism and spare tissues, they don't understand training volume and programming and knowing when enough is enough. More is not better. The right amount is better. Right. And they don't understand tissue adaptation rates. I mean, to prescribe exercise is a big deal. Yeah. It's a big deal, and you're determining that person's health for a lot of years. It's a big responsibility. You got to get it right.
Are they being taught this poor technique understanding? Are they being taught this in school? Is it because they're just defaulting to what they learned and with their high school football coach in the 60s or the 70s? I mean, what is behind this miseducation of our trainers at a high level?
Well, I have a theory on that. Now, I'm going to take off my scientific hat. My theory is I'm going to have to blame a lot on social media. Okay. In the old days, when you and I grew up, we learned how to consume science. We were taught to be skeptical, and when you heard something, you said, well, who said that? What was their qualifications? What are they basing that on? Now, the people who are actually doing the work and are true masters of their crafts, they're not on Facebook. They're not on Instagram. I don't even know how to sign on to Facebook. And yet, people show me my name being abused on Facebook by people who are not masters of the craft. They are masters of marketing to make money. And they put out the most awful things. There's a woman on there. If you're not a real woman, if you can't lift your body weight in a deadlift. Now another woman has come on. You're not a real woman until you can lift twice your body weight. And it's this bravado and misunderstanding of what really is required to be resilient and why we're exercising and doing these things in the first place. So that's my take on it. It's a terrible double-edged sword that we're living in. The internet could be such a wonderful thing, but right now it's people are Facebook educated, and it's awful.
It's interesting. I will just say that being around all these kids that I've coached for years, my workout might be 5 minutes every other day, and every dad looks at me like I'm crazy. However, I'm probably a better athlete than them, and half of them will do these long workouts that they're finding on the internet, and then they become incapacitated for long periods of a year while their backs are seized up or they've hurt themselves, and it's just because they're online surfing what a workout should be, and it's really, it's been destructive. And then they take that and then they push their kids into it, and it's been, to me, you're saying the internet, and I see there's a lot of similarities. When the dad sees this on his Facebook feed, his kid's going to do it, he's going to do it. Dad doesn't get the idea that when he's incapacitated, it might not be good for the kid to do it.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, Mike, half of my patients have been caused by the trainers that we're talking about here.
The only other thing I'll throw into that, and guys, I'm sorry if you know who I'm talking about, is that a lot of these kids fall in love with their coaches and their trainers, and it's very hard for them to understand their trainer is causing this trouble. I'm not singling anybody out, but you know who I'm talking about. Going back to the core a little bit and moving away from this, the one thing I left out was, can you describe the difference between our deep muscles and our fascial muscles and how they work together and what the importance of these two groups are?
I'm not quite sure what you mean there. We're talking about the core and the spine, I'm assuming.
Yep. So I don't know all the muscles that the groups are, but I know you have the psoas and obliques, but then we're also sheathed in like the fascia muscles.
Right. Okay, I think I'm starting to get to what you mean. If you look at an anatomy book, it says rectus abdominis, the six-pack muscle in the front, is there to flex the spine. But that's an anatomist talking, and that is not much to do with function at all. Because when you measure most people doing things in daily life, that rectus is not used as a flexor of the torso. It's used as a short-range stiffness spring. So imagine this. If I perform a sit-up, only 20% of the sit-up flexion power comes from rectus. Most of it comes from the oblique muscles, which are the hoop muscles that come around the core. Those hoop muscles create hoop stresses that go around, and if I had a muscle that was designed to flex the core, I'd have a hamstring muscle there, not the washboard muscle, but the washboard muscle has lateral tendons in it. Those lateral tendons are there to transmit the hoop stresses in a belt-like fashion around the core. So if I didn't have those tendons, I would rip that muscle apart. In other words, it's basically an anchor for a short-range stiffness spring. So when you measure someone who can throw a fastball 100 plus miles an hour, it's a boom across the hips, a second spring across the chest, and then the spring in the beautiful athleticism of the hand. You put those three springs together, and you will throw over 100 miles an hour. But that's a short-range stiffness spring of the abdominal wall. When we measure someone, again, throwing a jab, who hits the hardest jab? It's the one who turned their hips. Load the abdominals, and then it's a short-range stiffness spring. So we measure this over and over again. My point of all of this was the anatomy books give function to these muscles based on their line of direction, not realizing that every single one of those muscles is an agonist to the full movement. You're stabilizing here, you're unleashing there. What do the gluteal muscles do behind your hip joint? Well, the anatomy books say they extend your hip. Well, wait a second. When I am doing a squat and I use those muscles to extend the hip, it's also extending my knee. It's plantar flexing my ankle. I could have an artificial knee underneath my pants, and you couldn't tell if I was doing a squat because the hips are driving all those distal joints. So, the anatomists, I'm sorry to say, are very junior people in their understanding of function. So then when we get into discussions of deep muscles and superficial muscles, they're all agonists. They all have a reason. They're all important. You mentioned psoas, for example. Psoas is a hip flexor. So there is the rectus abdominis. There's the rectus femoris that goes down the leg, crosses the hip joint. There's iliacus that attaches the iliac crest to the femur, and then there's psoas that goes all the way up the spine. Well, some people have a fascial connection with psoas. So when they're stretching, doing a lunge perhaps, and stretching their hip flexors, if I said to them, put your hand over your head and feel the psoas tendon, and some of them say, wow, you just stretched my psoas. Well, I pulled on the fascia. And then with my hand at the top, I'm going to rotate it around like this while I'm stretching my psoas. And some people will say, wow, my psoas is moving. And other people say, no, it doesn't do anything for me. Showing that some people have a strong anatomy train, as Tom Myers would call it, or a fascial connection all the way through. So once again, when we watch these people and measure them throw 100 miles an hour, they have fascial connections. You can't do it with a single muscle. It is the sling that you stretch and unleash all the way through. So I don't know if that's answering more of your question, but in some people it's critically important, and you can measure it through some of the techniques that I've just illustrated. And other people, it doesn't matter much. But that's why, you get one guy who can pick 1,000 pounds off the ground, but he can't scratch his ear, and he sure as hell can't throw a football.
Awesome. That's great.
We're all tuned machines,
right?
And coaches have to look at that team, and you might find this experiment kind of fun. I did this one twice with two different volleyball teams. The coach asked, "Can you increase the vertical jump of these volleyball players?" And most performance specialists would have some form of squatting in there, whether back squats or front squats or whatever. Interestingly enough, the whole team did exactly the same squat regimen. Half of the team increased their vertical jump a couple of inches, 10% had no change, and 40% lost a couple of inches off their vertical jump. And I learned all I had to do was ask two questions, and I can predict what kids do well on that squat program and what kids are ruined by exactly the same squat program to jump higher. If I said to the kids, are you naturally quick or are you naturally strong?
Yeah.
And you can guess which group. They're the kids who are naturally quick. When I added strength through the squat program, they jumped even higher. But the kids who are naturally strong, and we added more strength, they slowed down because now they added more stiffness with the more strength. They didn't need more strength to jump higher. They needed a faster release of the tension and better springs. So, it's fun. It's like tuning a race car for the Indianapolis 500 or F1. You change the tire pressure, you better change the gearing on the transmission. It's what we do with athletes.
As a follow-up for a youth or high school coach, do you see a benefit in trying to address both of those? So I might not be able to get enough time to know 100 kids in a room who's naturally strong versus naturally quick.
All you do is ask them, Mike. They know this.
Okay.
This is the cool thing about it.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're naturally quick, you go over to that room, and you know who the spark plug neurology players are, and you know who that immovable object is as well.
Okay.
So there you go.
Another thing that I've experienced, a lot of kids in college, they've been lifting weights, D1 rooms, D2 rooms, end up having low back pain.
Right.
My experience is it's usually that their hips are very tight or they're not using their glutes. Their hips are their hamstrings, are in spasm, kind of perpetually from maybe years of youth sports not using them. Their glutes kind of look very flat. Doesn't feel like they're using them. Any thoughts on whether I'm seeing a symptom or a sign or what your experience is with that?
You're looking at both a cause and a symptom, but we have two issues going on there. The first is, you're right, some will have stiff hips. Now, there are many people who just have naturally deeper hip sockets. They can't squat that deep, and you'll give them femoral acetabular impingement if you keep trying to squat them deep, and you will give them discogenic back pain. So the trick there is to limit the depth of the squat. God didn't come down and say the Olympic cookie on the end of the Olympic bar is this big, and therefore you're going to pull starting 10 inches off the ground. That didn't come down from the mount. That was just some guy arbitrarily designing the Olympic cookie. So there's no shame in having an athlete pull off blocks. Okay. And now you've eliminated that whole problem. But for some reason, there's this bravado, do deficit deadlifts, stand on a box and pull down even further. You better be very, very careful with that one. Otherwise, you're going to be sending another patient to me.
They're breaking form. They're doing all sorts of things.
But anyway, having said that now, that is for people who have a naturally deeper hip socket. You're not going to change that. So just pull off blocks. And there's been several experiments in the NFL and in the NHL. When was the last time we saw an NFL player do a deep squat on the field? When was the last time you saw one in the NHL? Yeah. Most of their power, when you measure it, is hip external rotation. So, anyway, we're just about to publish another study, by the way, where we show the half depth squat creates more back strength and endurance than a full squat, where you go down, you actually relax at the bottom of the squat. So, in terms of athletic development, a half squat for most athletes will be producing better athletic results anyway.
So
and
you've
noticed
that 45
that
degrees? I'm sorry. Is it?
Well, you don't have to go down that deep.
Okay. All right.
And then, I look at some of your great Olympic coaches like Dan Path down in Arizona. I mean, you can't argue with his results. Who's got more Olympic sprinters than Dan? How often does he do a deep squat? The answer's never. So, let's go with the facts here and look at who's producing the success. But now that's a cause. Let's talk about the consequence. When you start to get back pain, there are neurological changes or corruptions. We already talked about that muscle memory in the engram. Well, if you give someone hip pain or back pain, the brain shuts down the glutes. So now the person becomes hamstring dominant. And if they have sciatic tension, say this is all caused by a disc bulge, and when I pull on the sciatic nerve root, when I'm stretching their hamstrings, more than half the time what they're telling me is tight hamstrings isn't. It's a tight sciatic nerve. So you can stretch that all you like. You'll actually increase the sensitivity. Now, you could stretch away muscle tightness, but if you try and stretch away nerve tightness, you only bring it on more. So, here are these poor athletes. Oh, every day I stretch my hamstrings, sir, and I only get tighter. And there's the suspicion. Good. Let me test you now in this nerve test. Oh, and there you have it. You've got a tight nerve. So
interesting. Anything for wrestlers, MMA fighters that we have not covered that you think is important?
Well, I've written books on this, as you know.
Yeah, I do. I know. I don't want you to give it all away.
Yeah, you can. I'm afraid at this point, without being specific, I would suggest people, for the interested readers, can I tell them about our website?
Yeah.
Yeah, so backfitpro.com is our website. That's BACKFITPRO, just like it sounds. Backfitpro.com, and they'll see several books. My book, Back Mechanic, was written for the lay public who have back pain, and the book guides them through a self-assessment of their specific pain triggers and then shows them what to not do and what to do. So that will get 95% of back pained people out of pain. Not all, but about 95%. Then now they can shift their training into developing their athleticism. So then we shift to the next book, which is Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance, if they're an athlete like a footballer or a wrestler. If they are a strength athlete like a powerlifter, the next book would be Gift of Injury. But anyway, they're stepped through the progression and guided through
the Gift of Injury. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the Gift of Injury, it changed my mental state. I was injured in college and misdiagnosed, and I've taken a long time to get better, and I go to your website all the time, but something about reading parts of the Gift of Injury changed my mentality a little bit. Can you just tell me a little bit about the thought process behind this book and the hope for people afterwards?
Yeah. Well, it's the beginning of the story of Brian Carroll. Brian Carroll was one of the most decorated powerlifters in American powerlifting. He had squatted over 1,000 pounds over 50 times in national and international competition. But then he phoned me up in 2013 and said, could I see him as a patient? And so he flew up. He's based out of Florida, so over 2,000 miles. And when I saw him, he hadn't realized that he was in a very, very dark place. He'd split his sacrum front to back. He'd crushed the fifth lumbar vertebra and the disc above and the disc below in real pain. And the surgeons even said, we don't even know where to start on this. Anyway, I said to him, I'll try and get you out of pain. No promises, but here's what I suggest you do. And then he said a very strange thing. He said, oh, good. And then I want to train to set the next world record again. And I said, well, if we can do that, we'll write a book about it. Well, you know what happened. That injury became his gift. We spent a year, since we knew what the problem was, we had some bone callousing to do. We had those fractures to repair only through exercise. But it was a very specific 5-day cycle of training. And then the second year he dedicated to restoring his athleticism. Well, the evidence that we show in the book were his MRIs of his spine when he came to see me. And you can see the horrific damage down the spine. Any lay public person can see what was going on. I also show the MRIs of his spine 3 years later when he's back squatting 1,000 pounds. His sacrum is totally remodeled. His L5 is remodeled. So it's a testament of how when a biological structure can get appropriate loading, it adapts and it transforms its shape to meet the appropriate mechanics. So good mechanics is tremendously therapeutic. We've done it so many times now that the evidence is quite overwhelming. And when I started to write this book with Brian, it was telling his story. I mean, those first 2 pages, they're very, very powerful emotionally. There he is. I mean, he's got a gun in his hands.
Yeah.
His cachet in life, he was the best powerlifter, and now it's all been robbed. what's left for him. But he took that drive, that very, the great athletes are just have magnificent minds and unidimensional drive to be the best. And he transformed that into his recovery. But when I found out he could write, we couldn't stop. I'd go down and sit at his kitchen table, and he'd come up. And what became of that book was something more than we ever anticipated. It became a manual for strength athletes to recover their athleticism after major back injury. So I hope you liked it, but that's what it became, a bigger project than either of us ever thought of. I might add, the foreword in it was written by Bill Kazmaier, world's strongest man for the first 3 years. On the back cover, there's a nice little piece from Blaine Sumner, who holds the world record for the highest Wilks score ever. I mean, these are guys who've been helped by our approaches. It's not random.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, I highly recommend it to anybody. That book, I've read. I'm at your website all the time, but and referring people. But that book, as an athlete, having gone through injury, having friends who have done that, it's a dark time, and there is hope. And use that drive that made you a really good athlete to make your body better.
Yeah, I'm going to say this, and I don't want the American listeners to take this the wrong way. Some will, but the American public and the American psyche is, you are the hardest working nation on earth. You work long hours. The downside of it is the Americans think bigger and better and more is better, and it isn't. The right amount is better. And it just pervades your whole training philosophy. When I study the Russian programs and their athletic development and whatnot, the concept of rest is just so much more important in creating those athleticisms. But Americans, it's almost a bravado position. Oh, on my day off, I only did 100 squats. Come on. You work too hard. Back off. And you will create, but anyway, I hope that book got people to realize that training is only to create adaptations that occur when you're resting. And that's where resilience for life and great athleticism built in the body comes from.
Agreed. I'd like to thank you for taking the time, Dr. McGill. And people, I'll put all of his contact information in the show notes. And maybe we'll talk again soon about some other specifics.
Okay, Mike. Well, thanks so much for all you do. And thanks for this podcast.